Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today I want to talk to you about trashy books, and I've got 5 different types of trashy book which I think provide trashy goodness for every palate. So as I've said on the channel before, trashy books should be fun. They are designed to be, a simple entertainment that will transport the reader away from the distractions and depressions of everyday life. They are, the fast food versions of books. They are easy to consume and give you an instant hit of pleasure. But clearly not everybody is going to like the same kinds of trashy books. We all have different tastes, and what appeals to one person in literature might completely turn off another. So I thought it would be interesting to talk about what I think are probably like the 5 main types of trashy book. Talk a bit about why I consider them to be trashy, why I think they can be very entertaining, and why I like them. And I am peculiar, I suspect, in that I like a very broad range of trashy stuff. I like pretty much everything. As long as it's easy to read and entertaining, I will pick it up. So anyway, let me talk through the 5 categories for you. So the first one is category romance. So category romance, if you don't know, is the kind of mass market Harlequin type romance that you see in bookshops and supermarkets and places like that. Maybe not so much as you used to, but the kind of romance novel that is written to a very set formula, where often a book is published every month, and when that month is over, that book disappears off the shelf. If you want a channel that talks incredibly knowledgeably about this kind of book, then check out Sarah at The Bookish Knitter. I'll try and remember to leave a link to her channel in the description. She is incredibly good at talking about this kind of thing. And romance is something that I've only really started reading fairly recently. It's not something I've particularly tried in the past, but I've read a few over the last year or so and really enjoyed them. And they are, they tend to be very, very formulaic, but there can be a real pleasure in reading something that has a formula when you know what that formula is and you're kind of bought into the whole process of it. So I've got a few different ones to talk about here. And clearly, these are going to appeal to people who like romance, but also just people who like books about relationships and interactions between characters, rather than more kind of action focused type stuff, which a lot of the other stuff in this list is. Right, so I've got a few for you here. So I've got Force of Nature by Christina Cook, which is a Harlequin NASCAR romance. So one of the things with category romance, and one of the reasons why it's called category romance, is they tend to be very specific kind of subgenres and series that focus on the same tropes again and again and again. So the NASCAR series, of which there's about 50, are about NASCAR racing, and about relationships between people in and around the NASCAR circuit. So promoters, drivers, mechanics, things like that. So I've read a couple of these and they have been very, very entertaining so far. I've also got one which I read. I think I read this for Garb August last year. Sweet Temptation by Lorien Blair, which is a silhouette desire book. So category romance tends to be either fairly tame or a bit spicier, and markets itself as spicier. So that the NASCAR books do not have explicit sex in them, but something like the Desire range from Silhouette will have explicit sex. So this one, I have to say, wasn't actually terribly good, but it's about a relationship between a woman who owns a sweet shop or a cake shop, something like that, and a guy who's an architect, who I have to say was a complete dick, which is why I didn't particularly enjoy this one. Another very popular category in category romance is kind of medical romance. So here I've got a Mills and Boon double with a couple of medical romances in it. I've read the first one in here, which is The Celebrity Doctor's Proposal by Sarah Morgan, which was quite a lot of fun. I haven't yet read the second one, which is A Mother by Nature by Caroline Anderson. But yeah, romance is centering around healthcare, the romantic industry of healthcare. And then I've got these two. So this is from a very niche series that was not recommend is the wrong word, brought to my attention by Roy from the channel Roy Reads Anything. So these are a series of Mills and Boon books. I think they were available in Harlequin in the States as well. Over here they were called Euromance. So they were written to tie in with the signing of the Maastricht Treaty, which kind of strengthened European ties in the 90s. And there were a number, I can't remember the exact number, there's a number of them, each of them kind of themed around a particular country in Europe. So I've got the German one, Designed to Annoy by Elizabeth Oldfield, and the Portuguese one, Haunting Alliance by Catherine George. Okay, so moving on then. So the male equivalent of category romance. So, you know, category romance, rightly or wrongly, is considered to be a female-focused genre. And I'm sure, you know, if you did a survey, the vast majority of the people who read category romance are women. The male equivalent of category romance is men's adventure. And men's adventure is a subgenre that has kind of died out, really. I think whereas category romance, you know, is still a big deal. You know, Mills and Boon and Harlequin are still publishing, you know, dozens of books a month, and still have, you know, big readerships. I think the readership for men's adventure books, which is, so men's adventure books are, as the title suggests, they're kind of, you know, adventure stories, war stories. Westerns were kind of a forerunner to men's adventure. So books with, you know, a lot of action in them that will appeal to a male audience. So, you know, the kind of literary equivalent of a straight-to-video action movie basically would be a good way to describe them. Often very long-running series centred around particular characters. And yeah, they've kind of died out. They've pretty much died out. You still get stuff that you could probably categorise as men's adventure turning up on Kindle Unlimited and places like that, but they're not really published in, you know, physical form anymore, which I think is a great shame. And I suspect that a lot of the reason for that is if you think about the role these played in terms of being a digestible form of, you know, action-oriented entertainment, I think that has been that role has been fulfilled by other things more recently. So in this kind of 70s and 80s, when these things were really popular, we didn't have mobile phones. We could watch movies and things like that on. We didn't have video games in the same way that we do now. And if you think of, you know, the guy commuting to work on the train who might in days gone by have read a men's adventure book, nowadays he's probably watching, you know, Sons of Anarchy on Netflix or something like that on his iPad, or playing on a Nintendo Switch, playing Call of Duty or something like that. So I think the market for these has dwindled because of other options that are available to the people who would have been reading these kinds of books. So anyway, I've got a few to talk about here. So I've got 3 books from the Executioner series. So the Executioner series, really one of the foundational series of men's adventure, started in the late 60s. There are over 400 books in the series about this guy, Mac Bolan, who in the early books is going up against the mafia, but then in later books goes up against kind of terrorists and aggressive foreign powers and things like that. So very kind of gung-ho American, kind of macho stuff, but a lot of fun. So we've got book 19, Detroit Deathmatch, book, I don't know which one this is in the series, it doesn't say, but Texas Storm, which is another fairly early one, and then New Orleans Knockout. So in these earlier books, he's basically travelling around America, going to different cities and fighting the mafia there. I mentioned Westerns, so the Edge series of Westerns, kind of on the cusp between Westerns being popular and men's adventure books being popular. So published in the 70s mostly, a series of Westerns written by an English guy called Terry Harknett, who went under the pen name of George G. Gilman. Fantastically brutal and entertaining books, very much kind of owe a debt to spaghetti westerns, Sergio Leone, people like that. But westerns, clearly have been hugely popular in the 50s and 60s, starting to become less popular in the 70s when the Edge books were published and things like The Executioner were starting to rise in popularity. And we've also got the Survivalist series, so I'm reading these at the moment. They're fantastically enjoyable. So they're not really sci-fi, but they are post-apocalyptic, so kind of drawing on the success of Mad Max and things like that. So lots of action, kind of radioactive mutants and stuff like that, as well as Russian soldiers invading America, all that kind of good stuff. And then I've also got this one, which I read last year, which was interesting because of its extreme topicality. And I've talked before about how I think trash fiction often cashes in on, you know, stuff that's happening in the world at the time. So this is a fairly short running series called Strike Force Falklands, about the Falklands War, so about British soldiers fighting in the Falklands against the Argentine forces. So the Falklands War was in kind of the early 80s. This book came out in 85, so I think it was published 2 or 3 years after the end of the war, so, you know, very close to it really. And these are, you know, kind of, again, pure gung-ho adventurism. Okay, moving on then. A very popular form of what I would consider to be trashy books is movie novelizations. So again, like men's adventure books, these aren't as common as they used to be. When I was a kid, pretty much every movie got a novelisation, or it certainly felt like that. And as I've said in a previous video, I kind of cut my teeth on adult books reading movie novelisations. They were some of the first, you know, kind of grown-up books that I read, including, I think, you know, in fact, Star Wars, the novelisation of Star Wars, is one of the first adult books I remember reading. So, you know, they were hugely, hugely popular. You do still get them occasionally, but not nearly as often as you used to. And I think, again, the reason for that is, when, you know, certainly when I was a kid in the 70s and going into the 80s, if you wanted to watch a movie, you had to go to the cinema to see it. You know, home video was in its absolute infancy. And it wasn't always, you know, even when home video took off, it wasn't necessarily always easy to get hold of movies in the same way that it is now. But in, you know, in the 70s, if you wanted to watch a movie and you missed it at the cinema, you'd be waiting 4 years for it to show up on TV. So movie novelisations gave people a way to experience films without actually having to go to the cinema. So if you missed a film at the cinema and you wanted to know what the fuss was all about, you could read the book. And I think they were very popular because of that. And served an important role because of that, but also, you know, they were easy money for publishers, because you could hire, you know, a writer who wasn't particularly well known, chuck the screenplay at them, get them to write a novel based off it, and publish it. And often they were written to quite tight timescales to get them out to coincide with the launch of the movie. So there are dozens of movie novelisations. I've just been looking around my shelves and I couldn't find that many of them. I used to have tons of them, but I think they got sold off years ago. But I did find a few random ones. So I've got this one, which is the novelisation of the 70s porn epic Caligula. So written by William Howard, albeit that wasn't his real name. I'm trying to remember what his real name was now, and I forget. Based on Gore Vidal's screenplay, albeit Gore Vidal later got his name taken off the movie because he didn't like what they did with his original words. So yes, this is very trashy indeed. I did do a video review of this a while ago. It was problematic in many ways. And then the other one I've got, which is probably something that won't be appreciated by people outside the UK, and indeed probably won't be appreciated by people who are younger than me, even within the UK, and that is, I've got a couple of novelisations based on the TV show The Professionals. So The Professionals was a TV show, and I think that basically the early 80s, about this kind of small anti-terrorist unit who used to, you know, go after terrorists, find them within an hour and kill them. So a lot of fun. I remember you know, being allowed to stay up late and watch The Professionals every so often. And there are a number of tie-in books written. I'm not sure if they're based on specific episodes or just based on the characters. But yeah, I've got a couple of those as well, which I'm going to try and read for Gulb August in August of this year. So that's movie novelisations. Another big one, and I think probably the one that is most popular at the moment in terms of having an appeal outside of people who would consider themselves to read trashy books, and that's kind of vintage horror. So the success of the Paperbacks from Hell book by Grady Hendrix and completely blanked on the name, Will Erickson. The success of that book has really driven an interest in vintage paperback horror from, you know, the kind of the 70s and 80s. And I've always been a big fan of that since the 70s and 80s when I was reading it as a child and teenager. So I've got a few here to go through, which are just ones I've plucked from the shelves. I've got loads more of them in the attic, but I couldn't be bothered to go upstairs and get them. So these tend to be you know, quite gory, quite over the top, you know, fairly short, as you can see. They're all fairly slim, and that really is a trait of most trashy books. Not all trashy books, but most trashy books is that, you know, they tend to be not too long. I think part of the success of this kind of vintage horror back in the day, so not so much now, where I think the success is largely to do with nostalgia. Back in the 70s and 80s, like with movie novelizations, horror was something that, unless you got to the cinema to see a horror movie, you didn't really get to experience it. And especially the kind of graphically violent horror, which, you know, okay, you could see at the cinema, but you couldn't see it at home. It wouldn't have been shown on TV, either in the UK or the US. And so if you wanted to, you know, experience that kind of thing, books was an easy way to do it. In the UK, that clearly persisted for longer. The Video Nasty Scare and the Video Recording Act that came into force in the UK in the mid-80s as a result of that scare meant that it was, you know, pretty much impossible to get many horror movies that would have been readily available in other parts of the world. And I think there was a boom in British paperback horror in the 70s, you know, kind of started by the work of James Herbert, but then in the 80s as well. And I think the 80s wave, if you like, was at least in part driven by the fact that horror fans in the UK, if they wanted to experience extreme violence, and who doesn't want to experience extreme violence in entertainment at least, they would have to turn to books to get it, because they couldn't get, you know, they couldn't go to their video store and, you know, rent The Evil Dead or something like that. So anyway, a few for you to talk about here. I've got Slugs by Sean Hudson, which is one of my favourites. I love this cover, and this is just a fantastic book. It's a killer slugs book. It's ridiculous because slugs don't move very quickly, so it would probably be quite easy to escape. But Sean Hudson is a master at creating gory set pieces, and he does it with delicious delight in this book. Really entertaining. Here's a Paperbacks from Hell one. So I haven't actually read this one yet, not got around to it. But this is Stage Fright by, who's it by? I've completely forgot. Garrett Boatman. So yes, but this is supposed to be pretty good, so looking forward to reading this at some point. I've got a random one I got off eBay a little while ago, Star Child by Fred Mustard Stewart, which was recommended to me in the comments by somebody, I forget who now. And then another British 80s one, Slime by John Helkin. So, you know, as I've said before, one of the traits of trashy books is having eye-catching covers that, you know, kind of pull the reader in and make you want to read the book. And who wouldn't want to read a book with a cover like this? Moving on then to probably the most mainstream form of trashy fiction. And I've only got one book to show for this, because again, all of my books like this are in the attic, so I haven't been able to get them down for this video. But it is what over here in the UK, and I'm not sure if this is an international term, but in the UK we call this kind of book a bonkbuster. So Jackie Collins is probably the most famous kind of writer of this kind of book. This is one of her early books, The Stud. She also wrote, you know, probably her most famous book is Hollywood Wives, which is fantastic, which I read in the run-up to Garb August last year. So, you know, the kind of book that has lots of sex, lots of rich people, lots of glitz and glamour, and is just, you know, kind of pure escapist entertainment. You know, like the other kinds of things I've talked about, you know, it gives the reader something that just lifts them out of everyday life. So, you know, Jackie Collins is, you know, as I say, probably the queen of this kind of thing. But you also get people like, you know, like Shirley Conran, Jilly Cooper. You know, there are lots of people who wrote this kind of thing, and indeed still do. So, you know, authors like Danielle Steele are still publishing today. I think Jilly Cooper is as well. So these books do still sell. So like the novelizations and the horror books, I think Bonkbusters give their readers, or gave their readers, particularly in the 80s, gave their readers something they couldn't get elsewhere. If you think about these books, they are 50% like a glamorous TV soap. So something like Dynasty, where you've got, fabulously wealthy people in expensive dresses, being bitchy with each other, and having arguments and being fabulous. Yeah. So that's 50% of what these books are. The other 50% is lots and lots of sex, and that's something you weren't getting on shows like Dynasty. And I think the amount of sex, the variety of sex, the explicitness of the sex in these books were definitely a huge part of their appeal, and something that the readers couldn't get elsewhere. You wouldn't necessarily get it in the cinema. You definitely wouldn't get it on TV. And I think sex sells, doesn't it? People are always interested in sex. So I think these books owe a large part of their success to providing providing sexually explicit and entertaining material to people who couldn't get it otherwise. Okay, time for a random book from the shelves. So this is a book that kind of relates back to some of the things I've been talking about here, in that it's a Western, and it is also trashy because it's written by someone who is famous for something other than being an author. So I think there's something inherently trashy about famous people cashing in on their fame in other areas. So like pop stars, making perfume and stuff like that. So anyway, this book is Payback at Morning Peak by the actor Gene Hackman, which is supposed to be a pretty decent Western, and I am looking forward to reading it. But as I say, I think there's something vaguely trashy about actors writing books. So, hope you found that interesting. Let me know if you're a fan of any of the types of trashy book I talked about here. Hopefully it's given you some ideas of different kinds of books you could read, either for Garb August or just in general. There's a lot to be enjoyed in all 5 of these different types of book, I think. But anyway, I will leave it there and say thank you very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.